Arcade Heroes.
Greetings, it's Adam with ArcadeHeroes.com, and I'm back for some business talk. Although I'm going back to the old format of just standing in front of the camera, no notes, no computer or anything. As a little while ago, somebody asked in a comment if I would talk about what brought me into the arcade business. So that's why I'm here. Now, of course, I can only speak for myself as to why other people might jump into the arcade business. Well, they all have their different reasons. Right now, I am working on a new book in regards to arcades. It'll be my third, actually. I don't do a very good job at self-promoting the other ones that are on Amazon, if you care to check those out. But this book, where I'm researching, or I'm going to discuss arcade history, I've been doing a lot of research into, well, every decade and every company that has produced arcade games. And as a part of that, you cover the Great Game Crash, you cover the Golden Age, all that stuff. And one thing that I've found rather fascinating in reading up on in Playmeter magazine in 1981, 1982 was the absolute explosion of arcade operators at the time. I mean, thousands and thousands of people jumped into the industry. And why is that? Well, it seems like most of them, it was because of money. It was a gold mine syndrome, so to speak, where after Pac-Man came around, people started believing, usually hearsay, as far as how much money the game was actually making. I mean, yes, it did earn very well, but people would take one thing that they heard from somebody else, from somebody else's cousin, and so on, and thought that it was making, say, $400 a day. In fact, I found a quote from a politician where he made that exact claim, whereas the reality was that it might be like $400 a week when it first came out, and then it would go down from there. And actually, a lot of the Playmeter equipment polls, where they would poll operators as to how much money they were making from particular games, Pac-Man wasn't number one for most months that I've come across. In fact, Asteroids and other games that, like Donkey Kong, Frogger, and others would be in the number one spot, while Pac-Man would often be, a few steps below that. Now, obviously, Pac-Man is the best-selling arcade machine of all time, and sold somewhere close to 300,000 units within the 80s. So obviously it sold very, very well, but just how much it was earning was not matching what people were believing. But regardless, lots of people might jump into the business for money. Now, of course, this is more than 40 years later. And if you're jumping into the arcade business for money, well, then you're going to end up very disappointed, because this is not the lucrative business that it was in, say, 1981, 1982, as that was a bubble. And the market correction, or the crash as it's usually called, in 83 and 84 is evidence of that, where there's too many people jumped in, there was too many games, there was lots of factors that contributed to that. But a lot of people went bankrupt and they lost a lot of money. And so would that be my motivating factor? Well, not my primary one. I mean, obviously it is a factor. I don't think anybody jumps into starting their own business without the intention of making money, because if you do that, then, well, you're probably not going to, and then you're going to go bankrupt, and then you don't have that business anymore, and the people that you could have employed don't have a job anymore. So obviously it has to be a factor. It's just, don't think of this as a get-rich-quick scheme, as it's certainly not that. Now, as I've pointed out in videos where I've talked about earnings and such, I've tried to emphasize that my earnings are subjective to a lot of different contexts, as to the size of my location, the location of the venue, the local competition, what games that I have, and if I have any other attractions, food, drink, laser tag, bumper cars, all that stuff. And I don't have any of that. I just have a pretty straight arcade with video games, pinball machines, and there are a couple of instant prize machines, like a couple of cranes up front that I actually don't own, a couple of instant merchandisers that I also don't own. We just get a split off of those. But what is it that brought me into this business? Why did I start an arcade as opposed to a restaurant or a clothing shop, as most of my neighbors in the mall happen to run? Well, good question. And so for me, the primary motivator was just a love of video games. When I was, I think, 2 years old, and granted, I can't remember this, but there's photographic evidence that my mom has shown me before. My parents got a Texas Instruments 99.4A computer for us for Christmas. And Well, I can't remember that exact instance. I do remember sitting on my grandfather's lap and him teaching me how to play some of the games like Hunt the Wumpus and TI Invaders and such. And I just remember being absolutely fascinated by video games. And that was actually the only console that we had at home for a long time, and so I usually had to play video games at other people's houses. I do remember going to my cousin's house, and instead of wanting to play outside, I wanted to go downstairs and play their Atari 2600 or their NES when they got one. All my friends had a game console. My best friend at the time growing up, he had all sorts of consoles. He had an Atari 2600, he had an Atari 800 XL, he had his brothers had a Sega Master System, and later the Genesis. He got an NES, and he later got the Super Nintendo. It was his house where I first played a 3DO as well, and so that's most of the time I was playing games over there. But it's like if I went anywhere and to play or just visiting somebody else with, say, my parents, if they had a game console, that's what I was wanting to do. And so I was just, again, very fascinated by that. Now, living in the suburbs of the area at the time, there was no arcades anywhere close, nowhere within walking distance. There was a 7-Eleven that was not far away that it could walk to that would have had a couple of games on it, but it was on the other side of an intersection. And as a little kid, that's not a place you're going to be able to go to by yourself. You know, that was one of the restrictions that Mom said was no crossing that particular road, or no going to that place unless we're with you, and that sort of thing. I do remember vaguely seeing a couple of arcade machines there. I guess 7-Elevens used to do that back in the 80s. But the first time I visited an arcade, I was 6, and I went to that aforementioned best friend's birthday party. We went to an FEC, a family entertainment center called the 49th Street Galleria, and we were given a small amount of tokens and told, go have fun. And I do remember wandering around that arcade. It was very dark, darker than my arcade is. It only had black lights. It didn't have track lighting or anything. And that was just incredible to me. I had never seen anything like it. And, you know, you had all these video games around, but everything about them was much cooler than what I had ever experienced at home. You know, the controls were different, the graphics were superior, the sound was superior. And of course, it was this symphony or cacophony of noise of all these video games all over the place. Now, I can't remember much about what I played, other than after I'd already spent my tokens, that's when I discovered a game called Discs of Tron. And for some reason, I don't know why, that game really called to me. And so I went around coin fishing, where you're going through the coin returns, hoping to find some tokens. And I believe I found some, and I was able to play the game, but I had no idea what I was doing. I didn't bother to read the instructions, and so I died pretty quickly. But still, something about that game stood out to me more than anything else. And so I wanted to find out what Tron was. And I can't remember the exact time frame of when everything happened. I remember that I had a friend who had one of those books. They used to publish books for movies so that they could basically advertise the movie to kids. and there was this Tron book that he had, and it basically told the story of the film, but it had some little additions here and there. But I remember reading over that and was like, wow, this sounds so cool. But I don't recall seeing the actual movie until I was maybe 8 or 9, somewhere around there. And this would have been long after the movie had been out of theaters. But when I saw that movie, that was, again, something like the discs of Tron calling to me, something about the movie called out to me, and particularly with the character of Kevin Flynn, and where he was designing video games out of his apartment, which was right above his own arcade business. Now, honestly, the thing that appealed to me the most at the time when I saw that was, man, I would love to make video games. I still want to make video games. It's just my life path has taken me on, or my life journey has taken me on some different paths. But one of these days I'll hopefully get around to it. But yeah, just this idea of living out of an arcade and making video games at the same time. It's like, that's what I want to do when I grow up. And my parents remember me saying that around that time of being 8 or 9 years old, and starting to talk about that sort of thing. And I came up with different plans as to what I would do with an arcade. And my original thought was to have something very similar to Flynn's, but even bigger and better, with some more modern games in it. But yeah, that just stuck with me for my teenage years and up until I became an adult. Now I've done other jobs that have nothing to do with arcades or video games and such. And as I had, or I guess backtracking a little, when I was a teenager, I had like a paper route and I worked at Domino's Pizza for a while and such. But there was a time after Domino's where I did work at an arcade, and that gave me some experience within the business finally, as to understanding what goes into the operation of a location, game selection, managing employees, scheduling employees, all that sort of stuff. And so that was a real eye-opener for me. And with that experience, I still decided, hey, I want to do this. And it was around that time where I bought my first arcade machines. As I recall, yeah, I just saved up enough, and I saw an ad in the newspaper, and there was a place in downtown Salt Lake City that had a bunch of games that they needed to get rid of because they were converting the space into something else, was a business, and it just had all these games sitting in their warehouse. And I picked up a Zaxxon and a 1942. The Zaxxon didn't work at first. I had to get that fixed. It took a few years, but the 1942 did. But that's how I got started in collecting, and I eventually had, I think it was about 8 machines in my garage, which included a Neo Geo MVS. It included an Asteroids Deluxe, which I'd found for free. A friend of mine found somebody throwing one out. It's just sitting on the side of the road, and they grabbed it. And so really just cost me $80 to get it fixed, to get the monitor fixed. And I had that, and I'm trying to remember what else I had. At a thrift store, I found a Shinobi, although it was originally a Frogger, but it was only like $25 at the time. And this was, so I guess backtracking really quick, one thing about business and success in business is timing. Oftentimes you could say it's luck, luck or fate, I don't know. But having the right timing does play into things. That doesn't mean that, say, like right now with inflation being what it is, particularly on game prices, because you can't find a arcade machine for $25 at any thrift store that I've seen ever since. If I have come across one, it's been $400, $600 and whatnot. But pre-eBay era, it was a lot more common to find machines that were cheaper. But you can still find success with, even if times have changed. But I just recognize that there were lots of very fortunate timing circumstances that happened in the lead up to my business getting started. And so yeah, I collected a bunch of machines, and with the intention of starting up an arcade. Now, in retrospect, what I probably should have done was start a route. Route is where you have some coin-operated gaming equipment and you find another existing business and you work a deal out with the manager to put your equipment in there, and then you get a split of the revenues. And sometimes it's 50-50, sometimes 60-40 or 65-35, etc. But either way, that's a great way to really get started in the business. Perhaps I didn't do that just because I was like, well, I've already worked in an arcade, and so I have a pretty solid understanding of that. But that would have been a good way for me to start generating some income, because that's one thing about this business in particular that is a challenge compared to other businesses. Now, well, I say maybe a clothing business or something else that maybe you can do out of your home. I mean, every business is different. Some businesses are going to cost millions of dollars to get started in, like an airline manufacturer or an airline company or a car manufacturer or something like that. But with an arcade business, it's going to take some capital to get started with. And this comes down to fortunate timing again. So, backtracking again, sorry, I'm jumping all over the place, but in high school, I remember taking an entrepreneurship class, and that's where I learned how to write a business plan. And so some years after that, during that class, the business plan I made was to make a game development company, not an arcade. But some years later, I decided, I want to get into I really wanted do this arcade idea and get into that business and take it from there. And so when I was working at a call center, a job that I really did not enjoy, I started developing my business plan. And there was an organization here in the United States called score.org. I'm not aware if they are still around. I imagine that they are, but they were a nonprofit organization that has all these resources to help people wanting to start a business to get things like business plan templates and business coaches and other things there. And so I remember using some of their resources. I don't remember finding a coach. And that was one of the most difficult things for me in the development process of doing the plan was finding information on the industry. Now, in retrospect, what I should have done was got a subscription to one of the trade publications. At the time, there was Playmeter magazine as well as Replay magazine. These days, the only magazine that exists to cover our trade is, there's two. There's Replay magazine, as mentioned, and then there's Intergame Online. Now, Intergame does focus more on the European market, but there's still things that you can glean out of it. But Replay is one that I've been writing for many years. But that is one that has a lot of good information, a lot of other business owners, whether they're arcade operators or manufacturer people, other salespeople that are involved in the business, FEC people and whatnot. They will write articles that can help you if you're researching the business to get that data that you need to be able to maybe put together a business plan. But I would highly recommend that if you are looking to get into the arcade business, that go into it with a plan as opposed to just jumping into it willy-nilly, because does a plan guarantee success? No, not at all. But it does help mitigate the risk somewhat, because it will force you to think about things that perhaps you wouldn't think about. Now, of course, the danger with any plan is that you're going to look at things in a much more rosy way than what the reality is going to be. And that happened with me. I remember part of the business plan was I had to project earnings and whatnot. And I remember reading, try not to be rosy in your projections and whatnot. And I went around to other places and asked them questions, other arcades. Some of them didn't want to talk to me. Other ones were willing to talk about what it is that they earned and whatnot. And so basing it off of that, I came up with some numbers and they turned out to be way off. They were like my real numbers were maybe a tenth of what I predicted, but it still allowed me to create a plan that I was able to take to a bank and I went to their business SBA loan specialist person, and I remember him telling me that he was one reason why he eventually ended up accepting my application for an SBA loan was because out of the 24 people he had helped in his position up to that point, I was the only one that came to him with a business plan. Everybody else just came in with a dream and some ideas, but they didn't actually take the time to really look at it. And so, at least when it comes to gathering capital, having a plan shows that you're more serious than somebody who just woke up one day, saw something on the news about something being popular, and it's like, I'm going to jump right into that because that's a moneymaker. Now, of course, capital is very important. It's essential because you can't buy these things off of goodwill or people just giving them to you. And there's many ways to raise capital. As I mentioned, I went for an SBA loan because my family was not wealthy, and so we didn't have existing capital to go off of. And that's also where I regret maybe not doing more operations with the intent of using that capital that would generate to be able to build my arcade. But sometimes there's methods like family members. In fact, I did have some family members help out and invested in the company. They purchased some equipment which they used to get their investment paid back. And I remember buying off, I think it was the Shrek and Indiana Jones pinball machine, was originally purchased by my aunt, my uncle, or one of my aunts and uncles. And they, eventually I bought it off of them. And so there was some family help there. But there are many different ways that you could go about raising capital, and I won't try not to spend too much time on that. But yeah, just as long as you can do that or have enough capital to be able to open up your business and survive for a while, because that's the thing is statistically most businesses fail within the first year. And I am very fortunate that mine did not fail, as it got pretty close. At the time, finding a location was a bit of a challenge. And so I'd got my business plan together, got approved for an SBA loan, had to use my house at the time as collateral. At least what I'd already paid on my house worked as the collateral. And it was really difficult to find the right place to open up. And so one of the things that you would hear if you study business is location, location, location. Now, where your location is plays a major role into how successful your business will be. Now, of course, there are certain businesses that don't require foot traffic, don't require people to come and visit you. But an arcade, you do need that. You can't operate that entirely online. Although I know there's been things tried before, like online crane machines and whatnot, playing them remotely. But generally speaking, in 99% of the cases, the arcade needs to be in a very public place. It needs to be in a high foot traffic place. While a mall becomes the sensible option for that. Of course, there's many arcades out there that have operated out of strip malls or their own buildings. And in fact, I'd say most of my competitors in the local region would fit that bill. I'm one of the few that operates out of an arcade. And I mean, really, most of the mall arcades that exist are really family entertainment centers where they have a lot more than an arcade there. I mean, just down the hall, I have a big one where they have bowling lanes and a bar and bumper cars, laser tag, all that stuff. And so it becomes an important factor in picking the right location. But when I first started, I tried a few different strip malls in the area that said that they were leasing out, and I got the runaround for the most part. A couple of them told me straight up that they didn't want an arcade, they didn't want that kind of crowd for their prestigious area or whatever it was. And so, of course, the landlord is always a major factor too, and that's kind of a roll of the dice. Sometimes you get great landlords, sometimes you get horrible ones. You just don't know. But if you want to make money, it seems like real estate's the one to get into, because if you're the one owning the building, you're the one making all that money from the tenants who are renting it out, leasing it out. But one that I had trouble with was a strip mall that was owned by Sears at the time, and they just gave me a lot of runaround, and eventually I just gave up on trying to get a hold of them, because I sent them everything they asked, but then you wouldn't hear from them for days, and you would send messages and not hear from them, and then suddenly they'd just get back to you at random, and they'd have some excuse, oh, I was on vacation, or my dog had the sniffles, whatever. And so I had a feeling they didn't really want me to be in there. And so I came to this particular mall, the Valley Fair Mall, and they were very willing to listen to me and at least sit down and have a meeting, which is something I didn't really encounter up to that point. Usually it was just phone calls and no thanks. But they did the mall here at first. There was another arcade, a small Namco owned arcade, and they didn't want to let me go inside, and so they put me on the outside of the building, which at the time there were very, very few tenants on the outside of the building, and it was kind of strange how it was set up, but that's what they offered me. And since I had already spent, I think, 7 months trying to find a location, I decided, hey, I'll take it. And my rent, as I recall, was either $2,400 or $2,500 a month, which is fairly good, but for a brand new business, as I would come to learn, and particularly in that spot, was fairly lousy. As again, I was on the outside of the mall, I had no neighbors. I was able to put my own sign on the side of the mall, and also operate my own hours, but yeah, otherwise I didn't have much there to draw in foot traffic. In fact, as I recall, the very first customer that came into our space didn't know that we were an arcade. They thought we were an entrance to the mall, and that was an unusual thing that kept happening to us in that first location. Was constantly people would just can I get through to the mall from here? It's like, no. This is its own little location and building almost. And so yeah, live and learn, I guess. I made the arcade extremely dark. I was trying to make it look like Tron because of how I was influenced to get into the business in the first place. And originally my arcade was called Game Grid Arcade. And so painted all the walls black. I painted the ceiling tiles black, which was a nightmare. Shouldn't have done that. And then I did fluorescent paints that would light up under black light, which looked cool, but it took me so long. I never actually finished doing the entire store like I wanted to do. And so, yeah, it was just a lot of painting work to have been involved with. And I probably should have hired somebody to do it, but I didn't really have that much capital, because the SBA loan that I got and a few of the loans that I was able to get from family members, it allowed me to purchase, I think, somewhere around 24, 25 machines and have a little bit of capital left over for paying rent. But as I mentioned, at that level where it was at, it was too much compared to what we were making. If I'm recalling correctly, our first month we only made $768. And I can't remember what subsequent months were, but as I do remember, it was oftentimes well below what rent was, and it wasn't long after I had opened up where I was able to take those numbers and present them to the mall leasing person and say, hey, can you lower my rent, please? Because the numbers are just not there. And fortunately, they were willing to listen because I guess I hadn't caused any problems with them that they experienced with other tenants. And so I was able to generate enough goodwill to convince them to lower my rent. But even then, when they brought it down to $1,500, it was still too much of a struggle out there. And that does remind me of a quick tangent point, is that one of the biggest challenges you face when you're starting a new business is that since you have little to no experience, you have no business credit to your name, a lot of people just kind of blow you off because they're like, you're just going to fail. And you run into that a lot. And I think that's maybe why I had a lot of landlords just kind of blow me off, because I was just this kid in my 20s, and I hadn't done anything like this before. I had just worked 9-to-5 jobs up to that point. And so there was no evidence that I was going to be worth their time to sign a contract and all that. And so that always made negotiating contracts and things a little bit of a challenge. And of course, had I done maybe the route business prior to that, I would have been able to say, yeah, I've done this sort of thing before. This will be a step up, but I have some experience in that of running my own thing. But yeah, that's one of those challenges that you face. But fortunately, I was able to overcome that. But it actually wasn't the arcades that kept me afloat at first. When I first opened, I was into LAN gaming, and I figured, hey, I'll do that. Now, I wasn't the only LAN game center that was around in the area, but there wasn't many. And so we only started with 6 computers, but we quickly found that that's what generated most of our revenue, at least in the first spot, was that because some teenagers found us, and we had Call of Duty 4, as I recall, and that was the main game that they wanted to play. And so we would have these guys coming in every single day, pretty much, and playing matches against each other on the network, and maybe going off and playing the arcade games. And that was kind of my thought. That's what I wanted to happen, as far as I wanted to draw in some modern gamers who may not pay any attention to arcades at all with the computers. And then when maybe they were having to wait their turn or wait for a computer to free up on in the LAN center, they would go and play the arcade games, and that actually did work. It's just the reason why I stopped doing that is eventually I was able to convince them all to let me inside, and when I did that, our fortunes changed dramatically. We started being able to cover our rent without me having to use a credit card to do that. And eventually I got to the point where I was actually able to pay myself, although it took a few years. And so that's one of the scariest challenges of operating your own business, is the uncertainty. You probably won't be able to pay yourself unless you strike it rich right off the bat and you have a concept that just blows up. I mean, that of course does happen, but there's many business owners where it takes a while for you to get to that point of it generating enough revenue that you can pay yourself, because you have to pay all these other bills first: rent and electrical and insurance and taxes and wages of other employees, and maintenance and new games and etc. And so I've been working a second, sometimes a third job on the side in addition to this. Oftentimes people will say, how do you have the time for all these things? It's like, I don't really know, but I've found a way. I guess I've just been used to it for so long now that I even to this day, I still do another remote job out of here, because that helps supplant the income, especially when the arcade isn't doing too great. I mean, would I love it if this was able to cover all the personal life costs? Absolutely, that would be great. But as I mentioned at the beginning, this is not a way to strike it rich, or at least very quickly, unless you already have a ton of capital. I mean, of course, if you have the capital to start a Dave & Buster's like business, then there is perhaps a good chance that if you know what you're doing and you hire good people and you get the right equipment in there, and you check off all those boxes that you need to for a successful FEC, then yeah, you can generate a lot of revenue. But starting small from the ground up, like I did, it's a real struggle to do that. Now, I'm not saying that to complain. I'm just trying to be real and not have anybody have this fantasy notion that that Pac-Man's still making $400 a week or anything like that. I'm lucky if it makes $4 a week these days. But yeah, there's these challenges that went into surviving, and I'm very grateful that I've been able to survive. I'm grateful for the customers and the regulars that we've had over the years, for the family members, for the friends that have helped out. That those have all been a huge support. And of course, as some of you know, I did have a second location at one point that I opened back in 2020, but I ended up closing that. I'm actually grateful that I closed that. I mean, it was still a good experience in learning how to manage 2 locations and managing more employees and all that. I certainly made mistakes in that, and if I could do it over again, there's certainly some things I would probably do differently. Maybe have tried for a different spot or within the mall where I had that at, or maybe a different game selection. But of course, there's always certain factors that you just don't know until you actually start the business. And that's, of course, where there's some huge risks that come in, because sometimes those things don't work out. In the case of my second location, and I have a video of this already discussing why I closed that down. I mean, one of the things that I just wouldn't have expected is how in that particular city people loved to go to bed early, and so the mall would be dead at like 7 o'clock. And arcades in particular generally thrive off of people staying up later and being out later, and so seeing how things would oftentimes die off after 6 o'clock, running up until 7 when the mall closed, or maybe it was 8, I can't call for sure now. I guess I kind of blocked that out. But I remember oftentimes feeling very frustrated by how dead it would be in the evenings, whereas this location in West Valley would be, it's always in the evening time where we are busiest. And there were some other factors that went into play with the movie theater, and the movie theater was able to be open, but we had to close off at that mall, and that hurt us. Whereas in this mall, we haven't had like security coming and screaming at us to kick everybody out like they did in the other mall. And so yeah, just things that you learn. But again, I'm grateful that I've made it this far. This will be the 16th year in business, and there's plenty of mistakes that I've made, and if you have any questions about those, perhaps I can do another video getting into those. But I hope that's provided some insight as to why an arcade business, why I did that. And yeah, I would say a lot of it has been just a passion for video games, and that's why I don't really have redemption games. And now I know that's probably the biggest mistake that I make, in not having a big redemption section and a big redemption wall and all that. And I've been told such by various people within the industry, because what makes the money in the arcade business these days? Redemption, ticket redemption, e-tickets and such. But I've wanted to show that just pure video games can still work, that as long as they're doing something different, unique, or they're exclusive to this industry, then they still can get played and they can still make money. And I do have some video games which out earn like the crane machines and such that we have here. But of course, it's not guaranteed in every single place that it would be like that. And of course, when you have redemption, that generally soaks up most of the attention from people, particularly the younger they are, when they want prizes and such, or that's what they've come to expect from other arcades. And so once in a while I do hear somebody complaining that I don't have anything redemption related, and then of course they go down to my competitors or go to the competitors down the hall, which does have a small redemption section and prize area. But yeah, I just want to keep fighting that good fight, and picking the right video games, I think, helps quite a bit. It's one reason why I still am giving pinball a good solid try, even though pinball does not earn as well as I wish it did. It is something that is kind of an attractor. It helps bring people in. In fact, yesterday, from when I'm filming this, I had somebody call me almost as soon as I opened my doors, and they asked about pinball because they had read about us online and they wanted to see what the latest was on that and verify that I had so many machines as claimed. And so that's just something to help bring people in, which again, they oftentimes do spend money on other games like the video games in addition to the pinball machines. Although there are some people who only play pinball, and that's fine. Yeah, there probably could be some other things that I could work on getting to help as far as an attraction goes to bring people in, much like pinball does. It's like I probably do need to have something like skee ball. I already have some basketball machines. Did recently sell off an air hockey table, but I will be getting another one here at some point. It's just as the current situation stands, the amount of debt that I'm in, particularly from doing that second location, plus the inflation on prices for pretty much everything in this industry has made it very difficult to invest into new equipment. And so I will be in Las Vegas here in a couple of weeks from when I'm filming this for Amusement Expo to look at all the new stuff that's going to be unveiled there. But I'm still not anticipating purchasing anything. Although there is one piece that I'm going to be getting from the show, but that has something to do more with Arcade Heroes itself than and a deal that I worked out, a marketing thing, as opposed to an investment from the business here. But stay tuned for details on that. I'll get into that more later. But yeah, what other questions do you have about getting into the arcade business and operating the business? Let me know in the comments below, and perhaps I'll be able to do another video diving more into those details. But thank you for watching this one, and we'll catch you on the next video.